Forget lasers, guard dogs, or alarms. The most effective anti-theft device on Earth is a criminal's own spectacular stupidity. Today, we're examining 10 robbers whose master plans violently backfired, proving that Mother Nature has zero tolerance for bad math. Do not attempt any of this unless your life goal is to become a cautionary footnote in a police file. 1. Let's talk about the exact moment a man realizes his entire life philosophy was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of Hollywood action movies. Meet our first visionary, a nocturnal tech relocator, which is a highly generous way of saying a guy who steals moderately outdated office keyboards, who found himself prowling a high-rise corporate plaza at 2 in the morning. He suddenly faced the incredibly terrifying prospect of actual consequences when he was cornered on the 15th floor by a solitary, aggressively unathletic security guard. This guard was armed with nothing but a flashlight and a crippling caffeine addiction, shuffling down the hallway with the urgency of a glacier. Now, a rational amateur criminal might surrender, or perhaps look for a dimly lit stairwell to make a standard, boring escape. But our guy? He operated under the steadfast terminal delusion that the laws of physics were merely polite suggestions for people who didn't own tactical gear. Spotting the elevator bank, he aggressively pried open the outer doors with his trusty crowbar, peered deep into the pitch-black abyss of the shaft, and decided this was his ultimate moment to become an elite urban ninja. His brilliant exit strategy? To execute a flawless, high-speed tactical descent by using the massive steel elevator suspension cables as a personal fireman's pole, gliding majestically down to the lobby. He even took a precious, highly dramatic second to strap on a pair of heavy-duty leather work gloves he'd brought along, undoubtedly smirking in the dark at his own brilliant foresight and improvisational genius. He was totally ready for his cinematic close-up. But here is a quick, fatal lesson in heavy machinery maintenance that our aspiring stuntman completely skipped. Elevator cables are not dry, textured climbing ropes designed for human grip. They are, in fact, absolutely slathered in an incredibly slick, viscous, industrial-grade synthetic grease, engineered specifically to eliminate all friction between giant, grinding metal components. So, when Jason Bourne over here confidently leapt out into the void and squeezed that primary steel cable, fully expecting a controlled, muscular, and heroic slide to freedom, the universe delivered a brutal reality check. He didn't slide down. He simply surrendered to gravity without a single microscopic ounce of physical resistance. Those heavy tactical leather gloves instantly acted like greased skis on a Teflon track, providing absolutely zero stopping power. He accelerated to terminal velocity in total, terrifying darkness, plummeting 15 stories with the aerodynamic grace of a dropped anvil, frantically gripping a cable that felt like a giant slippery strand of spaghetti. The completely unbothered security guard, who hadn't even broken a jog, later reported hearing a brief, fading yelp followed by a concussive thud that sounded exactly like a sack of wet cement being dropped from a helicopter directly into the basement. The thief's spectacular audition for a blockbuster action franchise ended abruptly at the unyielding concrete foundation, leaving the baffled investigation team thoroughly puzzled by the pristine, completely unscuffed condition of his tactical leather gloves, and officially closing the book on his incredibly brief, highly accelerated, gravity-assisted career. 2. Have you ever found yourself incredibly frustrated in the dark and made a decision so phenomenally detached from basic scientific reality that it literally altered your physical state of matter? Let's take a trip to a sketchy, perpetually damp gravel parking lot behind a defunct diner at 3 in the morning, where a spectacularly frugal criminal was about to perform a catastrophic chemistry experiment. This particular visionary was in the process of siphoning gasoline out of a massive commercial moving truck, presumably because paying at the pump deeply offended his core beliefs regarding personal finance. He had everything a budget-conscious thief needs: a cheap, heavily kinked rubber garden hose, a plastic jerry can, and a mouth tasting aggressively of unleaded fuel from manually starting the siphon. But there was a major infuriating problem stalling his illicit enterprise. The truck's massive tank was virtually empty, meaning the actual liquid fuel was barely a pathetic puddle at the very bottom, completely out of reach of his tragically short hose. Now, for those who haven't taken a basic science class since middle school, An empty gasoline tank is vastly more dangerous than a full one. Liquid gasoline burns, but gasoline vapor, the invisible, highly pressurized fumes rapidly expanding inside an enclosed metal container, is essentially a thermobaric weapon just waiting for an excuse to unleash absolute hell. Our financially motivated genius, shivering in the cold and furious that he was only extracting mere drops of precious fuel, desperately needed to visually assess the situation deep inside the unlit cavern of the tank. Lacking a flashlight, a smartphone, or a single functioning brain cell dedicated to self-preservation, he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a perfectly reliable dollar store butane lighter. With the absolute confidence of a man who fundamentally misunderstands how combustion works, he leaned his face right up to the open metal nozzle and casually flicked the flint to illuminate the dark void. He never even got a chance to see the bottom of the tank. The exact microsecond the spark caught the highly concentrated vapor cloud rushing out of the spout, the chemical reaction was instantaneous, catastrophic, and completely merciless. The massive metal cylinder instantly went from being a minor inconvenience to an active explosive ordnance, detonating with a deafening concussive shockwave that actually shattered the reinforced windows in the adjacent diner. The sheer kinetic force of the blast ripped the heavy tank completely off its steel mounting brackets and launched our improvised bomb technician backward through the air with the velocity of a crash test dummy fired from a cannon. The explosion ensured he was rapidly and irreversibly converted into a fixed part of the local scenery before he even hit the gravel parking lot. The arriving paramedics didn't need to ask witnesses what happened. The smoldering, jagged crater in the side of the truck and the melted puddle of plastic that used to be a jerry can served as a permanent, fiery monument to a guy who essentially tried to use a lit match to inspect the inside of a powder keg. 3. The raw, undeniable allure of cold, hard cash has driven humanity to build massive empires, cross dangerous oceans, and occasionally turn themselves into human boat anchors for absolutely no logical reason. This brings us to the damp, muddy perimeter of a sprawling commercial construction site, an absolute goldmine for a guy who viewed unsecured building materials as his own personal, highly illegal retirement plan. Our entrepreneur for the evening had set his ambitious sights on industrial copper wiring, the thick, heavy-gauge stuff that shady recycling centers pay top dollar for. No questions asked. He had successfully bypassed the fencing and found the motherlode, but immediately encountered a severe logistical nightmare: the sheer, crushing density of the metal. He stuffed his oversized backpack until the zippers screamed in agony. But looking at the remaining coils of lucrative wire left on the pallet, his aggressive greed completely overrode his rudimentary understanding of basic physics. Determined to extract every single penny of value, he began unspooling dozens of yards of the thick copper and wrapping it tightly around his own torso, layering it tightly under his winter coat like the world's most conductive and heaviest corset. He was essentially constructing a medieval suit of armor out of pure ballast, adding nearly 70 pounds of dead weight to his core. Just as he finished his metallurgical cocoon, the blinding sweep of a police cruiser's spotlight hit him, instantly transforming his lucrative midnight stroll into a high-stakes athletic event. He bolted for the perimeter, running with the awkward, clanking gait of a mechanical golem, his spine visibly compressing with every heavily weighted footstep. The pursuing officers didn't even need to sprint, openly laughing as the thief sounded exactly like a violently shaking toolbox crashing through the underbrush. Desperate to escape the flashing lights, he burst through the tree line and found himself teetering on the edge of the city's deep, concrete-lined storm drainage canal. In a massive, panic-induced lapse of judgment, he remembered watching fugitive documentaries where suspects successfully lost the dogs by swimming across rivers. Forgetting entirely that he was currently dressed as a vintage deep-sea diver without the oxygen tank, he took a heroic, desperate swan dive directly into the murky, freezing water. There was a surprisingly muted splash. Archimedes' principle dictates that an object will float if it displaces a volume of water equal to its own weight. But solid industrial copper practically laughs at the concept of buoyancy. The very moment he broke the surface, the immense, unyielding weight of the tightly wound wire pulled him straight down into the black water with terrifying, unstoppable speed. He couldn't swim, he couldn't tread water, And because he had meticulously wrapped the rigid wire tightly over his own arms and under a heavy soaked jacket, he physically couldn't unspool his precious cargo to save his own life. He sank directly to the muddy bottom of the deep canal like a literal stone, achieving the ultimate grim irony of successfully hoarding his stolen wealth for the rest of his extremely short, completely submerged life. 4. Let's dive into the acute psychological condition known as extreme criminal paranoia, a magical state of mind where every distant, unrelated noise is interpreted as a heavily armed SWAT team coming specifically to ruin your night. Our next tactical mastermind was experiencing a severe, career-ending flare-up of this exact condition, while standing entirely uninvited inside the main kitchen of a 5-star downtown steakhouse at roughly 4 in the morning. He wasn't aiming for the cash register. He was targeting the massive walk-in freezer, greedily loading a reinforced duffel bag with tens of thousands of dollars worth of premium, dry-aged Wagyu beef. Just as he was lovingly admiring the marbling on a particularly expensive tomahawk steak, the piercing, unmistakable wail of a siren echoed loudly through the back alleyway. Now, a rational human being might peek out a window to assess the threat. Instead, our heavily caffeinated meat rustler instantly went into full bunker lockdown mode, firmly believing the police had deployed a tactical perimeter just to secure the stakes. Retreating deep into the sub-zero, stainless steel cavern of the industrial freezer, he stared at the heavy door and decided that the standard latch simply wasn't secure enough to repel a hypothetical police battering ram. Industrial freezers are legally mandated to have glowing safety levers on the inside specifically to prevent accidental entrapment. But our guy viewed this life-saving feature as a massive security vulnerability. Taking his heavy-duty steel crowbar, he aggressively jammed it straight into the internal emergency release mechanism, violently twisting and hammering the metal until he had permanently wedged the thick deadbolt into an utterly immovable locked position. He practically high-fived himself, marveling at his own impenetrable, frosty fortress. There was just one tragically hilarious flaw in his flawless defensive strategy. The siren he heard wasn't a police raid at all. It was simply a passing ambulance rushing some poor guy to the local hospital. As the wailing completely faded into the quiet city night, our hero decided it was safe to abort the mission and head home. He casually grabbed his crowbar to unwedge the door, only to violently discover a harsh lesson in thermodynamics. The freezing temperatures had rapidly contracted the metal components, essentially welding the tightly wedged steel bar into place with thousands of pounds of pressure. Panic immediately set in. He pulled, he drop-kicked the door, he screamed at the immovable stainless steel, but the crowbar wouldn't budge a single microscopic millimeter. Within 30 minutes, the brutally sub-zero, aggressively circulating air had completely sapped the feeling from his extremities, rendering his hands completely useless, frozen claws entirely incapable of gripping anything, let alone dislodging a structurally integrated piece of solid steel. He had successfully barricaded himself inside a giant, mechanically operated icebox with absolutely zero chance of rescue. When the confused prep cooks finally arrived for their morning shift, they didn't find a master thief. They discovered a perfectly preserved, highly tragic frozen statue curled up in the fetal position, having successfully protected his stolen inventory by becoming a permanent, rigid fixture of the deep freeze storage. 5. Some guys are born with razor-sharp survival instincts. And then there's our next contestant, a man genetically hardwired to select the single worst available option in any high-pressure situation with almost supernatural consistency. This catastrophic talent was about to reach its absolute apex while he was operating a highly illegal, stolen 1000cc racing quad bike at roughly 80 miles per hour. He had just successfully liberated this incredibly loud, aggressively overpowered off-road missile from an industrial power sports warehouse, tearing through the chain-link fence and merging directly onto a massive, completely abandoned stretch of unfinished interstate highway. He was feeling like the absolute king of the world, the midnight wind violently whipping through his non-existent helmet, right up until the exact moment he spotted the terrifying, flashing red and blue lights of a lone highway patrol cruiser parked horizontally a few miles down the blacktop. Now, standard evasion tactics would dictate maybe turning down a side road, or perhaps ditching the incredibly loud, neon green ATV in the brush and running away on foot. Instead, our vehicular mastermind tapped into his inner stealth bomber pilot and formulated a plan so monumentally stupid it actively defies the fundamental laws of self-preservation. To achieve total invisibility and slip past the cops unnoticed, he reached down and completely killed the quad's powerful halogen headlights, plunging himself into absolute suffocating, pitch-black darkness. He didn't slow down. In fact, fueled by pure adrenaline and supreme arrogance, he actually pinned the throttle wide open, rocketing blindly down the unfinished asphalt like an unguided ground-level torpedo. He was incredibly proud of his tactical genius, totally unaware that driving a roaring, 1,000-pound combustion engine in the dark doesn't actually make you a ninja. It just makes you a spectacularly fast idiot with zero forward visibility. Because his headlights were completely extinguished, he entirely neutralized the city's primary safety mechanism for this specific stretch of road: a massive, aggressively bright, high-visibility retroreflective barricade. Reflective paint, by its very scientific definition, requires a strong light source to bounce back to the viewer. Without his headlights to illuminate it, the giant orange and white stripes screaming "Bridge out" were essentially invisible in the rural darkness. He blew past the barricade without even tapping the brakes, instantly transitioning from horizontal travel to vertical plummet as the unfinished concrete overpass abruptly ceased to exist. There was a brief, terrifying 3-second window of absolute weightlessness where his brain finally processed the catastrophic error of his stealth methodology, right before the unrelenting laws of gravity reintroduced him to the Earth. The stealth operation officially concluded with an earth-shattering crunch at the bottom of a dry, 80-foot concrete drainage ravine. The bewildered police officer slowly drove up to the edge, peered down with a flashlight, and officially logged a report about a guy who successfully hid from the cops by rapidly and definitively relocating himself directly into the afterlife. 6. We really need to have a serious national conversation about the catastrophic damage Hollywood action choreographers have inflicted upon the critical thinking skills of the general public. Countless blockbuster movies have aggressively hardwired the delusion into our collective brains that jumping from a perilous height into any random receptacle magically negates all kinetic energy and guarantees a soft, delightfully bouncy landing. Our next architectural acrobat was a dedicated student of this cinematic nonsense, currently starring in his own personal action sequence roughly 90 seconds after smashing through the back door of a rooftop electronics store with a duffel bag stuffed full of high-end laptops. He was frantically sprinting across the flat, gravel-covered rooftops of a dense 3-story commercial district, desperately trying to outrun an astonishingly athletic pair of pursuing police officers. He was absolutely crushing the parkour fantasy, leaping over air conditioning units and vaulting ventilation shafts with the desperate grace of a man who is severely allergic to jail time. However, he eventually reached the absolute edge of the final building, staring down into a narrow, dimly lit alleyway with the cops closing in fast right behind him. He needed an exit strategy, and he needed it immediately. Peering over the concrete ledge, his eyes locked onto a massive, open-topped industrial dumpster sitting directly in the shadows below. In his adrenaline-soaked, movie-poisoned mind, this wasn't a giant steel box of hazardous waste. This was a Hollywood stunt cushion, a magical portal to a safe, comfortable getaway filled with fluffy garbage bags and soft, discarded cardboard boxes. Without taking even a microsecond to actually inspect the contents of his chosen landing zone, he channeled his inner stunt double, offered a mocking salute to the arriving officers, and confidently yeeted himself straight off the 3-story drop. He executed a flawless swan dive into the darkness, fully anticipating that deeply satisfying cinematic whoosh as he safely sunk into a bed of discarded restaurant leftovers and bubble wrap. Unfortunately for his fragile bone structure, this specific alleyway didn't belong to a bakery or a mattress store. It belonged to an active, heavy-duty masonry renovation project. He didn't jump into a fluffy cloud of urban refuse. He had spectacularly targeted a 20-yard, reinforced steel roll-off container packed entirely to the brim with demolition debris, shattered concrete slabs, jagged cinder blocks, and dense construction steel, essentially a swimming pool filled with solid rock instead of water. The universe did not provide a soft, bouncy landing. Instead, it provided an immediate, viciously unforgiving lesson in solid-state physics. He hit that literal ton of industrial rubble with the velocity of a dropped bowling ball and the definitively final crunch of a total structural collapse. The pursuing officers, who had rushed to the ledge fully expecting to see him sprinting away down the street, instead found themselves staring down into a highly abstract, modern art installation of catastrophic decision-making. His Hollywood escape plan worked perfectly in theory, completely removing him from the jurisdiction of the local police department and instantly transferring his case file directly to the closed records department, definitively proving that real-world garbage is significantly less forgiving than a movie script. 7. Let's take a moment to marvel at the profound architectural optimism required to look at a narrow, industrial kitchen grease exhaust pipe and confidently think to yourself that this is a VIP entrance. Our next visionary was a weekend opportunist who decided a temporarily closed gourmet bistro was completely ripe for the picking on a quiet Friday night. Lacking the necessary skills to quietly bypass a standard deadbolt, he scaled the building, stood on the flat roof, and stared down into a heavily reinforced metallic ventilation shaft. Instead of recognizing this as a massive metal tube designed explicitly to suck hazardous, sticky cooking fumes away from industrial fryers, his movie-poisoned brain processed it as a perfectly viable, completely straightforward slide directly to the cash register. With the absolute, unshakable confidence of a man who firmly believes Santa Claus physics apply to full-grown adults in the real world, he contorted his frame and aggressively shoved himself directly into the pitch-black opening. Here is a rapid, completely unforgiving lesson in commercial HVAC engineering that our hero spectacularly failed to research. Grease ducts do not drop straight down, and they are definitely not smooth. They are sharply angled, highly tapered metal funnels permanently coated in years of incredibly slick hardened animal fat, specifically designed with overlapping steel baffles. The exact second gravity took over, his foolish descent instantly transformed into a one-way trip inside a mechanical vice grip. He slid rapidly past the point of no return, his shoulders aggressively wedging against the narrowing steel walls. This instantly triggered the absolute worst biological trap known to man: the exhale ratchet effect. Every single time he exhaled in a wild panic, his ribcage naturally compressed, gravity pulled him exactly 1 inch deeper into the narrowing funnel, and when he desperately tried to inhale, his chest physically couldn't expand against the unyielding industrial steel. He was instantly transformed into a tightly compressed human cork inside a vertical metal tube. He couldn't reach his phone, he couldn't kick his legs, and his frantic shouting was entirely absorbed by the thick, acoustic insulation meant to muffle heavy fan motors. As the long, quiet weekend dragged on, the brutal reality of his situation fully set in. Without a single drop of water, exposed to the sweltering, stagnant air trapped in the upper roofing, his internal systems began a rapid, completely unavoidable countdown to total shutdown. By Sunday afternoon, his biological clock forcefully hit zero, permanently checking him out of the robbery business due to a critical lack of hydration and absolutely zero airflow. When the deeply confused morning prep cooks finally arrived on Monday to fire up the grills, they immediately noticed a massive, bizarre blockage in the ventilation system. They hadn't been robbed, but they did have to make a highly awkward phone call to the local authorities to report that an aspiring master thief had successfully bypassed their security system by permanently installing himself as a rigid, highly ineffective physical filter in their main exhaust infrastructure. 8. A frozen river in the dead of winter is nature's most elegant death trap. The surface looks solid, crossable, almost inviting, but underneath lurks a lightless, freezing labyrinth with zero exits and absolutely no forgiveness for idiots. Our next intensely overconfident fugitive was about to beta test this particular death trap during a spectacularly ill-advised midnight marathon through a densely wooded municipal park. With a terrifying symphony of aggressive police sirens wailing in the distance and the rapidly approaching, blood-chilling barks of highly trained K-9 units echoing through the freezing trees, this particular criminal was desperately running out of viable options and cardiovascular endurance. Bursting violently through the frozen underbrush, he arrived at the steep, muddy bank of a wide, winding river that was completely capped with a seemingly thin, treacherous layer of early winter ice. Most rational humans would view a freezing, solidly iced-over body of water as an impassable geographic barrier. But our guy's brain, completely hijacked by sheer panic and a delusional confidence in his own athletic abilities, formulated a spectacularly doomed aquatic escape plan. He figured he could execute a tactical plunge, hold his breath like a professional Olympic freediver, casually swim a few yards downstream directly under the ice to instantly break the dog's scent trail, and simply smash his head through the frozen surface like a majestic, breaching killer whale to catch a breath. Without a single microsecond of hesitation to reconsider his life choices, he aggressively threw himself straight into the icy abyss. But here is exactly where cinematic fantasy violently collides with unforgiving biological reality. The absolute millisecond his body hit the brutally freezing, ice-choked water, he experienced an involuntary, completely uncontrollable physiological reaction, scientifically known as cold water shock. His chest violently contracted in a massive spasm, forcing an immediate, desperate, wide-mouthed gasp that instantly filled his lungs with freezing, muddy river water instead of vital oxygen. Furthermore, diving under a completely frozen river at night instantly plunges you into absolute suffocating darkness, where the very concepts of up and down completely cease to exist. Disoriented, freezing, and rapidly losing his fight against physics, he flailed blindly upward, finally pressing his bare hands against the slick surface to execute his brilliant, heroic ice-breaking maneuver. Unfortunately for his grand escape, his fragile fleshy skull was structurally inferior to 4 solid inches of reinforced, tightly compacted river ice. He pushed, he punched, and he frantically battered his head against the rock-solid frozen ceiling, but it didn't even crack a millimeter. He was permanently trapped in a lightless, freezing horizontal lockbox of his own deliberate making, right as his muscles completely locked up from severe, rapid-onset hypothermia. The frustrated K-9 units arrived at the riverbank just moments later, aggressively barking at the massive hole in the ice, while the completely disoriented, rapidly expiring fugitive drifted silently away underneath the frozen surface, definitively proving to the universe that human beings are simply not equipped with the anatomical hardware required to successfully play submarine in the middle of winter. 9. A suburban strip mall jewelry store, 11 p.m. Shattered display glass glittering across the sidewalk, an ear-splitting alarm screaming into the night, and one extremely confident criminal hauling several trays of high-end diamond watches through the front door at full sprint. Everything about this getaway was textbook perfect, except for one catastrophic wardrobe decision that was about to make him the most expensively dressed corpse in the county morgue. Our guy was experiencing the exhilarating, adrenaline-fueled high of what he assumed was a flawless getaway, bolting down the bustling concrete sidewalk at maximum velocity, with stolen merchandise tucked under his arm like a diamond-encrusted football. However, he had made a fatal sartorial error that morning. He deliberately chose to wear a pair of incredibly loose, highly elastic, completely unstructured baggy fleece sweatpants. Furthermore, because he apparently viewed proper tactical holsters as an unnecessary financial burden, he had simply shoved his heavy, fully loaded, safety-off semi-automatic pistol directly into the unforgiving, ultra-stretchy abyss of his waistband. Now, let's quickly review the fundamental, unbreakable laws of gravity and kinetic energy. When you combine a dense, heavy block of machined steel with the violent, bouncing, up-and-down motion of an all-out athletic sprint, that unsecured weapon is only traveling in one inevitable direction, straight down towards the pavement. About 50 yards into his triumphant escape, the entirely predictable disaster occurred. The heavy firearm violently slipped past the incredibly weak grip of the elastic waistband and began aggressively plunging down the inside of his pant leg. Driven by pure, thoughtless panic and the desperate desire to not drop his highly illegal weapon on the public sidewalk, he reached down to perform the absolute most expensive, highly reactionary crotch grab in recorded human history. His uncoordinated hand frantically clamped down blindly through the thick fleece fabric, desperately trying to arrest the gun's downward momentum. In a masterclass of tragic clumsiness, his wildly grabbing fingers didn't catch the textured grip. They squeezed directly, tightly, and forcefully onto the completely unprotected trigger mechanism. The weapon immediately discharged entirely inside his pants. At point-blank range, the round ripped through the cheap fabric and scored an absolutely critical hit on his own leg, instantly hitting the worst possible spot and triggering an immediate, unpatchable system failure. It wasn't just a severe injury, it was an incredibly rapid, unavoidable countdown to a permanent game over. His triumphant sprint abruptly turned into a collapsing stumble as his internal clock forcefully hit zero. He checked out permanently right there on the sidewalk with his stolen watches scattered around him, serving as a grim public service announcement about why investing $15 in a basic leather belt is vastly superior to turning your own leg into the ultimate target practice range. 10. Meet the kind of guy who watches heist movies and genuinely believes the only thing separating him from a criminal mastermind is better costume design. Our final genius of the evening was parked ominously in a windowless, entirely unventilated cargo van just 2 blocks away from the massive commercial bank he was actively preparing to rob. He had meticulously studied the security camera layouts and concluded that a standard, fabric ski mask was simply too amateurish, too easily identifiable, and frankly, completely lacking in theatrical flair. He wanted to be a totally unidentifiable, faceless phantom. His brilliantly idiotic solution? A heavy-duty, industrial-grade aerosol can of liquid rubber sealant. The highly toxic, incredibly volatile stuff normally used by professionals to aggressively waterproof cracking roofing tiles and seal massive leaks in boat hulls. His grand vision was to literally spray paint a seamless, form-fitting rubber mask directly onto his own skin, completely ignoring the massive skull and crossbones warning label practically screaming at him from the side of the canister. Sitting in the driver's seat with all the doors firmly locked and the windows rolled up tight, he violently shook the metal can, held it mere inches from his face, closed his eyes, and aggressively held down the nozzle. The can immediately unleashed a massive, incredibly thick, noxious cloud of aerosolized, highly reactive chemical polymers that instantly filled the tiny, airtight cabin of the van. The fumes were overwhelmingly potent, immediately triggering a desperate, involuntary physiological gasp for air. He took a massive, deep breath, powerfully inhaling an enormous volume of the dense, floating, liquid rubber particulate cloud directly into his respiratory system. This is exactly where basic chemistry transformed a terrible idea into a hyper-disastrous, completely irreversible situation. Aerosolized liquid rubber is scientifically formulated to cure, polymerize, and harden incredibly fast the absolute second it makes contact with any warm, moist environment. The delicate interior of the human lungs is essentially the ultimate, perfect catalyst for this specific chemical reaction. The microscopic droplets of industrial sealant hit his warm, damp bronchial tubes and instantly triggered a rapid chain reaction, violently vulcanizing and expanding. The liquid rubber literally cemented itself to his internal tissues, rapidly curing into a thick, completely impermeable, solid elastic barrier that permanently sealed off his airways from the inside out. He had successfully, flawlessly waterproofed his own lungs. The panic was instantaneous and completely futile. He couldn't cough it out, he couldn't exhale, and he certainly couldn't inhale as his entire respiratory tract rapidly turned into the structural equivalent of a solid car tire. He permanently ran out of breath in the front seat of his getaway vehicle long before the heist even officially began, leaving the baffled first responders to discover an aspiring bank robber who had successfully hidden his identity from the cameras, but unfortunately permanently cemented his bizarre legacy in the local police history books. The internet needs to settle this right now. If we had to cast a solid bronze Darwin's Idiot trophy to hand out to one of these legendary failures, who definitively earned it the most? Drop your vote and why in the comments. I'll be roasting the bad takes. If you love seeing natural selection aggressively enforce the law, obliterate the like button and subscribe for more.